Now you run on home to your mother and tell her everything's alright and there aren't any more guns in the valley. To most, this familiar quote will be remembered from 2017's neo-western noir film Logan, but it was Alan Ladd who, as Shane, spoke it to Joey in 1953's classic western masterpiece, Shane. When looking back through a Rockwellian lens at the seemingly idyllic decade that was the 1950s, you get those iconic images of Shane and other westerns of a proper yet hilariously accident-prone Lucille Ball, James Dean dancing across those boxy cathode ray TV sets that were exploding in prevalence throughout the suburban homes of the era. Joe DiMaggio's home runs cracked with energy and excitement throughout American living rooms via tabletop transistor radios, all while the conservative yet black and white morals and values of faith and societal norms helped shape popular culture. It was also a time towards the early part of the decade when comic book sales numbered in the millions, but peel through that halcyon exterior and you'll find much darker undertones, punctuated by a Red Scare, a nuclear race, a civil rights movement. You'll find hydrogen bomb tests, Sputniks, Doomsday Clock at 2 minutes to midnight, and you'll also find a magazine industry on the verge of collapse. So much so, in fact, that it took DC Comics to save its rival, Marvel Comics, from shuttering its doors. Hi, I'm Jesse, and you're watching JLS Comics, a channel that's all about comic books, superheroes, movies, anime, video games, you know, all the good stuff. Thanks for pressing play. In part 1, we're talking about a time when DC Comics saved Marvel Comics. Part 2 will tell the story about how Marvel Comics almost saved DC Comics in the 1980s. So let's get right into the story. To really understand how two publishing rivals would be in a position to save each other, you need to look at the socio-economic realities of the time. And to understand how Marvel Comics could go from publishing 60 plus titles to just 8 in the space of a year, we need to explore the world in which that reality existed. And to do that, we need to back up about 10 years from when this occurred. So we travel all the way back to 1945. When the Japanese surrendered to the American delegation on the deck of the USS Missouri, it formally marked the end of World War II. It also brought a rapid drawdown on the amount of troops stationed overseas. Millions of US military personnel returned home to celebrate, I'm using air quotes, unintentionally planting the seeds of the proverbial baby boomer generation. During World War II, comic book subject matter was that of the war itself, from Jack Kirby's cover of Captain America punching out Adolf Hitler, as well as titles like War Heroes, GI Combat, Captain Midnight, Navy Tales. It was part of a pro-American propaganda and time of patriotic superheroes. But when the war ended, these larger-than-life superheroes' popularity waned. In their wake, publishers turned to crime, horror, and love stories to fill their four-colored pages, and not everyone was thrilled with this evolution. And this is where we meet Dr. Frederick Wertham. In 1948, just a couple years after the end of the war, Wertham began his assault on comic books when Collier's magazine published a column highlighting his pediatric psychological research called Horror in the Nursery. When that piece made its rounds, there was mass outrage from parents to dioceses to scout leaders to community leaders alike. Americans' Puritan ideals were being assaulted, and their children's minds, Wertham pretends of course, are being groomed for deviancy. This is when the book burnings began. The Spencer, West Virginia burning lasted over a month as children continually found kindling in the form of comic books to add to the massive pile. Shortly after Spencer came the burning in Binghamton, New York. Residents of the New York town went house to house collecting comic books and ended up scorching a pile of books 2,000 large. In 1949, a massive book burning in St. Mary's was conducted by Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, the town church, and shortly thereafter, it was Vancouver's turn, burning nearly 8,000 books. Fuel for the fire continued to be fed by national magazines and their psychopathology to comic book features, often quoting and citing Wertham himself. In retort, and in an attempt to assuage the masses, Marvel Comics under Martin Goodman published an anti-Wertham editorial. Thus, with 1949 and the decade drawing to a close, so too did the golden age of comic books. And all those baby boomers were getting to that reading age where they could pick up books and read. Enter the interregnum. Comic books and superhero popularity continued to decline and sales plummeted. McCarthyism was rampant in the halls of the U.S. Capitol, but it also continued to hammer the public perception of comic books. Dozens of publishers such as Atlas, National Periodicals, EC Comics, Harvey, Dell, and Fawcett struggled. In fact, facing continued declining sales, many were forced to shut down in this early 1950s era. Those that didn't close restructured or rebranded, such as Martin Goodman consolidating all of his companies under parent company Magazine Management, dissolving the Timely brand and evolving selling it into the Atlas publishing brand. Martin Goodman's cousin by marriage, Stan Lee, came on board, managed over 60 titles under Atlas. National Periodicals, the company that would become DC Comics, went back to the wholesome ideals of the Golden Age superheroes in response to the Wertham crowd and the public perception of book subject matter at the time. It allowed them to stay vitalized. Siegel and Schuster's Superman was still wildly popular. National Comics Publications licensed out its products and IP. In fact, The Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves, began airing courtesy of WB and RKO. Superman helped keep the proto DC Comics company in the black, while others struggled. Then, in April of 1954, disaster strikes. Frederick Wertham rears his fear-mongering head once again with the publishing of Seduction of the Innocent. It allowed Wertham to strut and fret his hour upon the stage. The book was a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Wertham argued that Batman and Robin were psychologically gay, that they encouraged the youth reading these books to act out sexually or in a criminal or deviant manner. The book was devastating to publishers, and public outrage had reached a zenith. So devastating was the effect on hearts and minds that the recently established U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency famously held a 3-day comic book hearing. Senators called up DC Comics, the VP of Dell, Helen Meyer, EC Comics publisher Bill Gaines, Monroe Froelich from Magazine Management Company, under which Atlas was published and distributed, by the way, and even a psychiatrist under the employ of DC Comics. The fallout from the trial was a bloodbath for the industry. Max Gaines ended EC Comics publication of his 3 horror and 2 suspense story titles. EC Comics distributor Leader News closed as well, and the book burnings continued. In 1954, in an attempt to self-regulate and stay alive, Carmine Infantino, Martin Goodman, Jack Leibowitz, and folks from Archie Comics gathered to establish the Comics Code Authority. DC continued their wholesome push. In fact, during this time, Hal Jordan, Barry Allen, Kathy Kane, the Legion of Superheroes, Supergirl, Challengers of the Unknown all debuted in mid-1950s. But for others, at least 15 other publishers like Avon, Ace, Mainline, and Nidor closed. Quality Comics sold all their IP to National Periodicals. Charlton Comics bought both Mainline and Fawcett. DC's wholesome strategy and its licensing allowed it to be in a position to buy out some of these dying brands, thereby additionally strengthening National Periodicals as a whole. But Marvel, while not a dead brand, was faltering. In 1956, Martin Goodman, per the advice of Monroe Froelich, the man who testified at the Seduction hearings, shut down Atlas News, the distribution company he owned under his magazine management parent company. Instead, he planned to outsource distribution, thinking it cheaper, less of a liability to use a BPO, business process outsource company. So he contracted for 5 years with American News Company. It was a massive, near monopolistic, nationwide distribution company. And this is where they would begin to distribute their 60 plus titles that Lee, as the EIC at the time, oversaw. Not 6 months later, American News Company abruptly folded due to a drawn-out restraint of trade lawsuit, and some say the mob was tied to it, but that's for another video. The sudden closure of such a large, massive company that managed distro for a large percentage of the industry was catastrophic. The already cold field of publishers continued to decline. The number of titles being published went from somewhere around 650 a month to just 250 per month. 2 months before the closure, sensing the end was near, Dell pulled out, and the owner, Delacorte, formed their own Dell distribution company. As soon as Dell left, so did other magazines like Popular Mechanics, New Yorker, Newsweek, having now seen the writing on the wall. Marvel too was now left without a distributor for its massive output of content. So Martin Goodman was forced to meet with Jack Leibowitz, co-owner of National Periodicals and Independent News. And National was the publisher, Independent being the distributor. It was a last-ditch effort to save Marvel. Atlas. It was an opportunity for Leibowitz to further bolster his National Periodicals portfolio. Stan Lee himself recalled at the time in 1988 interview, "We've been turning out 40, 50, 60 books a month, maybe more. And suddenly we went to either 8 or 12 a month, which is all Independent News would accept from us." Now, this was partly to stick it to the rival, partly because Leibowitz didn't want to further fracture the market, and partly because he'd always wanted a low number of titles mentality. He figured just a few would be sufficient, and he forced Lee and Goodman to cut their line line from 64 titles to just 8 per month. There were massive firings. Lee had a stockpile of art to pull from, so that's where they would do instead of contracting with other artists. There were massive downsizings. Gene Colan said he saw Stan Lee go from a giant office to a closet. Lee had to call up Joe Sennett, Jack Kirby, John Romita, Dick Ayers, and all of the employees for layoff. It was a time to be creative. They skirted the 10-year contract rules by publishing bi-monthly titles and combining characters into the same book. For example, Tales of Suspense was a combo book that became Captain America 100 and Iron Man with a first issue in 1968. Same with Tales to Astonish. That became Hulk 102, and then Submariner #1 spun out of it. And Strange Tales became Doctor Strange 169, and Nick Fury issue 1 spun out of that in 1968. And this was because Goodman was able to work with Leibowitz to, over time and over the years, loosen up the constraints. And towards the beginning of the 60s, they were pumping out upwards of 16 titles, so double. Towards the end of the 10-year contract, 1967 in fact, Kinney National, which became Warner and merged with Time Warner, purchased National Periodicals under the Detective Comics line. In 1968, a year later, Perfect Film and Chemical Corporation, which was a precursor to Cadence Industries, purchased Goodman's magazine management as well as Curtis Circulation. And finally, in the 1960s, Goodman's deal with IND ends, and the company moves along to Curtis Publishing. That's when you see the IND that graced the book during that time period change to the CC logo, and thus was the end of the Silver Age of comics. So there you have it, the fascinating story of a time when DC Comics stepped in to save a faltering Marvel Comics from going out of business. As you can see, understanding the social, political, and economic climate of the time is crucial to understanding the why behind what happened with Marvel and DC, how they would even entertain such an idea, let alone agree to it. It was such an important and riveting time in the comic industry, so it's fun to learn about these types of things. But stay tuned for part 2 of the story, where I'll tell you about the time when Marvel Comics nearly returned the favor, a time when the roles were reversed and DC Comics was faltering and needed help from Marvel. That'll do it for this video, part 1 that is. Let me know your comments down below what you thought of this video, and if it's your first time here, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and be part of the JLS Comics family. Love to have you here. Thanks guys, and I'll see you in the next video.